So on today's episode, we're talking about communication, the gift of communicating with confidence. Not everyone has it, some people don't. What can we do to foster better communication between multi-agency partners is the question that we're posing today. And I've got loads of multi-agency partners today that's going to explore this with me. So I'm going to introduce, or they're going to introduce themselves, I should say. So starting with you, young man, please do tell me your name and where you work.
Hello, Ian Cameron. I'm Head of Public Protection for the South West BCU, and that's basically South West London, part of the MPS.
Lovely. And yourself?
Hi there, I'm Richard Burnsmith. I'm head teacher at Hotham School, which is a primary school in Putney.
Hi, I'm Aileen Hamilton. I'm the name nurse for Safeguarding Children in Central London Community Healthcare.
My name's Derek O'Cindy. I'm a social worker based within the Brief Intervention team in Wandsworth.
And I'm Lindsay Birtles. I'm the Service Manager for Quality Assurance in Wandsworth Children's Services.
So I think it's only right that I start with our quality assurance expert, because the concept of having a critical friend, to me, is another professional that works with us that can challenge our positioning, tell us where we're going right or wrong, but there's an art to do it. So every day, your focus is looking at people's work in children's social care and multi-agency and critiquing that. So how important do you think the critical friend concept is?
I think it's really important, and I think it comes into sort of every layer of the work that we're doing. So I think as social workers, one of the key relationships where you get that is with your manager in supervision and with your team in group supervision. I think those are really important factors for having a critical friend, those people to kind of keep you focused on the work that you're doing, keep you focused on the child, but also to help you explore what you're bringing into those relationships yourselves, your social graces, your identity, to think about how is that influencing the work you're doing, your belief and understanding about that family, and how can you use that to help the work, but also how can you recognise when that's a challenge and have someone to talk to about it.
But it doesn't always feel like a friend. And so I think, the concept of it being a critical friend, sometimes it's not sensitive. Sometimes it makes you really question your practice and where you think you've done a good job. It may make you feel less than adequate. So for example, you've assessed a family and you've deemed that the family's been made contact with, or the intervention hasn't been appropriate, and you would say in an audit purpose that this is inadequate. Derek, who is a social worker, not that you ever do that kind of work, receives that information. It doesn't feel very friendly, does it? So what's your concept on this critical friend notion?
I think it's very important. We work in a multidisciplinary way anyway. The majority of the time, we're working alongside colleagues from housing, colleagues from mental health, professionals working in domestic violence services, and children, adolescent mental health services. So we work in a way where we're used to having different opinions, having different views, and in a way where we're also willing and able to accept that we have different opinion and views. The point is that we work together and we keep the focus on the children and the families. Yes, sometimes it's going to feel like there's criticism, but I think what's important is that we're all working towards the same thing. And what's beautiful is that we're also meant to learn from each other. So I think one of the things that I really find positive about having a critical friend, whether it is, like my colleague said, your manager, or whether it's other professionals that we work with on particular cases, or that we might have built relationships with over time. I think it's important to listen to each other, take on board each other's thoughts and views and perspectives, and also come from a position where we are focused on learning from each other, because that's also how we help to spread good practice, and it's also how we help to improve our own practice.
How easy is it to influence like practice change in the police force? You guys are quite regimented. You've got the law that you run by and your focus is crime. And how do you take the opinions of others that may not understand the lens that you're looking at in terms of criminality?
It can be challenging at times, because obviously we do have different priorities, different missions, different values. But I think it's fair to say is the police was a standalone, really, an organisation 20, 30 years ago, and it didn't really have much involvement with our other agencies. However, I think a lot of work has been done. Obviously, a lot more needs to be done as well, working with local authorities and other key partners. And for us, and especially for myself in public protection, it's critical that we have other people, critical friends, looking at what we do, because we can't obviously do everything by ourselves, and sometimes we need support. You know, there's a lot of professionals within our partnerships who've got key skills in areas where we haven't got key skills, and to be honest, it's invaluable having and working close with those people to ensure that we're doing things properly.
Do you think the critical friend element looks different in healthcare? Because you have, again, expertise. So you've got your surgeons, you've got people that specialise in gynecology, people oncology. How can you be critical for a service that you know nothing about or you're not trained in?
I think it's being very respectful of someone else's expertise. So if someone is an expert in the area, then they're the person that you want in the room, the person to have written the report, to inform everybody else about what actually, for example, with a child, what their particular needs are and what the examination has shown. So it's really important that it can be challenged, but we need to respect the expertise from within the room, but we certainly need to be open to challenging experts as well.
And I was thinking, in terms of education perspective, often we get the feedback that schools don't feel like their voice is heard. What position do you think you guys feel in that ability to be that critical friend?
So I think for me, I mean, schools have a really important position because we know the family, we know the child so well, we see them so regularly. I think that's perhaps why school leaders or practitioners in schools feel like their voices aren't being heard in the way they would like, because they feel like they know the children so well, they see them every single day. But I think, therefore, school leaders need to be able to build a picture quickly, and they need to be able to communicate that clearly to others in a way that other professionals will understand.
What will enable them to do that, though?
So I think it's being able to summarise, being able to pull lots of different pieces of information together that you want to get across to another professional, understanding the parameters which other professionals work within. So I think, for example, in schools, we don't often understand thresholds very well. And try as we might to communicate, often that's a barrier which we come up against is, you know, this hasn't met this threshold or another threshold. So really understanding kind of the legal frameworks which other professionals are working with would help us, because often we're running with the day-to-day. We know the children, we know the parents really well, and we have that really important picture. And being able to take that picture and kind of assess it against frameworks we're working against, or other professionals are.
And I'm wondering, the other agencies, hearing what school may or may not need to develop that, I don't want to say confidence, but the ability to communicate in the way that we need to receive the information. How would we advise schools to do that better? What could they implement?
I mean, for me, I think it's not just about schools. I think it's about all agencies. You know, I think all agencies need to really have a good understanding and support their practitioners to have a good understanding of the thresholds, the criterias, um, for all of the other agencies. So everyone is clear on what each agency can do and can't do, and why they can or they can't. So really, I think it's about making sure that people understand the protocols of each agency. One way of kind of talking about that would be, for example, understanding information sharing and how for different agencies they have different protocols on what they can share, whether it be the police, for example. As a social worker, I work alongside. Sometimes I might have to go to meetings for MAPA or meetings for Marek, and you know, there's information that comes out of those meetings that I can't share with other people. So I think it's about being very clear. All organisations need to support their staff and need to drive the importance of practitioners being very clear on the protocols, the legislation, the thresholds, the criterias of the services that they're working alongside.
You're right, because I think there are sometimes, you know, I've managed MASH teams and there's police information held that I can't share with professional networks, and that really impacts the work that we can do collaboratively and individually. How can we help police, and I say broadly, or your service, to understand the importance of needing to share that, you know, seamlessly?
It is a difficult one for the police, especially certain types of information. We just, under law, we can't disclose it. But you're right. We do find sometimes we don't pass all the information which we can pass on in a timely fashion. That does obviously cause issues for partners later down the line. But again, as you said, for the practitioners, I think, from my opinion, even the practitioners sometimes, especially within the police, don't understand the full legalities of what they can and can't do. And that's why they do go on the side of caution sometimes and don't share some key things, because they're very worried about what will happen if they share the wrong information. So it is a concern for myself and probably the organisation that you have a lot of junior officers don't fully understand the legislation, the partnership, what we can and can't share, what agreements have been put in place within the partnership to allow sharing of information and what type of information. And for me, that is a concern.
And you mentioned junior officers, and I'm thinking of expertise. I think my communication skills have developed because of my experience, because of exposure to families and cases and different teams I've worked in. How do we support the newly qualifieds in each of your designated areas to be able to communicate effectively? Because ultimately, they're still safeguarding children and families, and they need to do that now. They can't wait 10 years down the line. How can we ensure that our newly qualifieds are getting that confidence and quickly?
So one thing I would say is culture. So, in schools, for example, we're small communities, and you need a culture within a school, and I'm sure it's the same in every organisation, of obviously putting the child first. I find a really open and honest culture as well, where everybody communicates within that organisation honestly and openly. Because then a new person coming in, or a new colleague coming into that setting, they're entering an environment where that is the norm, and everyone around them communicates in that way anyway. And hopefully that then enables them to build confidence to be able to then communicate in the way that we would want when they get into that position. So yeah, building that culture within the organisation first, and then when you're then interacting with others, you have a central belief which you can then kind of come back to whenever you're challenging something. If you've got the child at the heart of your culture, it makes it very easy then to make those challenges or to be that critical friend.
Lindsay, do you find that as well? The disparity in styles with our newly qualified versus our more experienced?
Yeah, I'd agree with you. I think like in any profession, your experience and your expertise in doing something grows over time. The more you're exposed to different situations and different multi-agency networks, and the more you're exposed to those challenging conversations and being up against situations where not everyone's agreeing and having to navigate that, I think of course that's going to lead to you developing more skills to be able to do that. But just building on your point about the culture, I think it's also really important to have a culture where it's okay to say, I don't know, I need to ask someone. And I think that's really important. I think that's what we need to foster for our newly qualified social workers. Is it's all right to come and ask someone else and get advice, and you're not on your own with it. You're not shouldering it on your own. You don't have to face those challenges that you're not sure about on your own. Come and ask, and that should be at all layers of our organisation as well, because if you feel confident saying, I don't know, you're going to get the help that you need to develop those skills and manage those situations.
I've got quite a good example there.
Give me one.
We were having difficulties about a year ago. It started. It was a young child in Wandsworth who suffered from quite significant neurodiverse conditions, and she was being stopped on a daily basis because when her conditions escalated, her behaviour got quite violent. She would lash out at people. None of it was her fault. And unfortunately, she always ended up not unfortunately, but she always ended up dealing with frontline officers who didn't understand the conditions at all she was suffering from. Because obviously a lot of our frontline officers are quite young in age, quite junior themselves. So because they didn't have those key skills and knowledge, they ended up a lot of the time handcuffing her, because they thought that was the only solution to stop her, for example, hurting herself or hurting other people. Obviously, this was happening almost on a daily basis. And obviously, it was quite shocking when I obviously was watching the body-worn footage of it. But you could see the officers were trying to help, but just didn't have the skills. So this is when I worked quite closely with the RCB and the NHS to find some individuals from there in the partnership who had specialist skills in neurodiversity, who could basically provide to us some key information. So this was obviously a specific case whereby they came in. they supported the trigger plan, we call it, whereby there's a plan in place for that child, which has got key things on it, which obviously we upload to our police national computer. So when an officer meets that child in the street, they've got it on the computer and they can see that to de-escalate the situation, try this and this. And what we saw is, because this is being rolled out now further afield across London, because it's a really good idea whereby we're having professionals, for example, social workers who obviously had a lot of dealings with this child. Obviously, NHS had a lot of understanding of neurodiverse, but obviously the police, we're not experts in it, and that's the key issue. So I used the partnership for that. And since obviously the trigger plan's gone in place, now simple things like, for example, when a police car arrived with the blue lights on, that would escalate her behaviour slightly as well, going in that upward direction. So it's simple things like don't approach with the lights on, don't talk about, for example, family, because obviously that was part of the challenges she was facing. So once officers actually knew that, she never got into that position where she was escalating, where she was, having to be handcuffed. So since we've had that in place, I've had not one single further stop.
That's really
But
good.
I think the key thing about it is how effective it can be when you have like critical friends.
Yeah, to say.
Providing you guidance, like the social workers are invaluable, because obviously they were with her almost every day, all day sort of thing. And obviously we bump into that person occasionally when a member of the public calls police because of the behaviour that person's suffering from in the street. So yeah, I think, you can see the benefits whereby leaning on the key partners, and obviously we do that a lot, especially with Wandsworth. We use those key skills because we understand that we're not experts.
And that's the thing, because you're often communicating, not only if we looked at communicating with families, we have to consider many things, race, language, what they can understand, their own disabilities. When you're dealing with professional interaction, do you make this assumption that because I've got a degree or because I work in this field, I can receive this information? And often what we found is that, in employment, our own lenses and our own disabilities and our own needs are not shared. So sometimes we can't receive or give the information in the same way. How sensitive do you think we are about our colleagues and their own needs, especially in communicating with them? Do we ever consider that?
I think people do more so now than ever before, but we've got a long way to go. And people feeling brave enough within employment networks to share with their colleagues that they've got maybe a hidden disability.
And I think we probably have a better understanding of that for people in your team or your manager or people you manage if you are a manager. But whether you're sharing that with multi-agency networks you're working with, particularly if, like most social workers, you're working with lots of networks, so you're obviously going to come across some interactions where that's not going to be understood and that's not going to be known. Some of those things might not be visible. People might not be thinking that about you in that situation. So I think it's about, we have to keep in mind that we're never going to know what everyone's bringing into those spaces, and we have to be quite mindful of that with professionals.
But that's where the respect comes from. And I was wanting us to consider the balance between critique and support. And what does that look like, and where do you find that balance? Or how do you ensure that balance?
I think for me, the most important thing is that, we have to be kind to each other. We have to be kind to each other. We're all working towards the same goal. We're all working in an environment that can sometimes be chaotic, can sometimes be stressful. And I think, the reality is there are a lot of, for example, people who have autism, ADHD, and other neurodiverse conditions. And, a lot of these conditions sometimes are managed, and sometimes they are, people have more, depending on how much stress someone's under, they may respond differently when they have a condition like such. So I think it's just about being kind to each other, being curious and supportive, and being thoughtful about the questions that we ask and how we interact with each other.
And I was wondering, you as a qualified social worker, there are, levels of hierarchy. So then you've got your team manager, you've got your service manager, you've got your department heads. And I wonder how confident you feel communicating on those levels. Does it change as you go up?
I don't think so. Not for me personally.
Is that because you're confident?
I've been a social worker 13, 14 years or something. But I think it's about, maybe for me, it's about my personality. I want to learn. And I know part of learning is being able to speak to people, ask the questions that you need to ask. I also know, I feel very much that there's no such thing as a stupid question. I also believe that we're all meant to be working together. And so because we're meant to be working together, we need to learn from each other. So I don't personally have an issue with speaking to anyone up the chain. We're all the same. We all have a right to be where we are. And that goes also for all professionals, whether in health, education, mental health, probation, youth offending, whatever, we are all here to do the same job. And so we need to be good role models for the children and families that we work with, and also for our colleagues and professionals and fellow professionals. So I think that really means that we shouldn't see hierarchy, because we're all just human beings trying to do something good, you know. Yeah, and I'd like to think that local authorities that I've worked in, and Wandsworth's a local authority where I've seen this very much, everyone fosters good relationships, everyone's kind to each other, everyone's supportive to each other. It'd be very difficult to actually know what the structure is, because everyone's so open and honest and helpful.
And I think that's what our director has developed, a very open door, sit on the same floor. I know he's got his own office on another floor, you wouldn't believe so, but he sits with all of us. So I guess it's just adopting and mirroring how your leaders. I think that's why it's important as leaders, for you to foster that environment. So as leaders in your field, how do you foster that openness and what he was saying?
So I think one thing we need to do as leaders is be humble and be very open about the things we've got wrong. So a bit like the example you just gave, Ian, is, talk and share those examples of learning that we've had within our own organisations, and not being scared of doing that, because, it's not a weakness at all. In fact, it's the opposite. And if you as a leader can stand in front of your staff or your colleagues and say, this is something which happened, this is how I became aware of it, this is what we've put in place, and this is the situation now, I think it creates that environment where people realise it's okay to get things wrong, as long as we learn from them and we make sure that our organisation improves and gets better as a result. So if we're able to do that as leaders within an organisation, then that builds that culture of an organisation where it's okay to challenge things and to be that critical friend.
Do you find that easy where you're from?
Transparency is quite challenging sometimes in the police, but I think...
Why is that though?
Well, obviously we mentioned culture, and obviously it's changing a culture is not an easy thing to do. It takes time. For example, I've often had comments, for example, because I'm quite a supporter of reviewing and getting partners to review body-worn footage, for example, of stop and searches. I think it's an excellent way to identify good practice, bad practice, and obviously deal with it. Obviously, a lot of people would disagree with showing footage of that to the wider partnership, but obviously I'm against that, and I think I've obviously shown a lot of footage to the Wandsworth partnership, and I think we've had some positives from the stuff, but we've also had some negatives as well. But I see that as a learning tool most of the time. It's people who haven't really appreciated the situation they're in before, obviously taking whatever action they've taken. And for me, it's obviously speaking to those people to find out, what will they actually think. It's not a criticism of them. It's just it's providing feedback to them of that situation. Yes, obviously it's after it, so you could say it's hindsight, but that's how we make changes, by obviously looking at stuff after they've happened, reviewing it, and making changes where possible. So that's why I quite like the partnership we have and the people we bring in to view those footages, because the footage of those incidents, because it really does give a different lens.
And how do you foster openness in the NHS? I mean, you've got multiple changes, losses, overworked, underpaid. How are you able to do that as a supervisor in that field?
I think it is about leadership from the top of the organisation and all the way down, where people are able to own up when they've made a mistake and not feel that everybody is going to criticise them, that there will be support there will be understanding, and that as an organisation, we're a learning organisation, so we will learn. If one person has made that mistake, then it may well be that other people have as well, and we can all learn from it. So there would be, an investigation into what went wrong, and then it would be fed back to the person, and wider learning within the organisation would take place.
I think the word investigation, again, as a practitioner, makes your heart jump and you're like, oh my gosh. And sometimes, I mean, old school, I want to call it old school social work, it came from a very blaming culture. And, I think I joke with Lindsay about audits, and I really hate them because it makes your heart jump and you're like, oh, I either don't want to give that feedback because I worry how the person will receive it, or they feel blamed, or how can we ensure that our audits and those processes are received in the way they're intended?
So I think it's really tricky. I think, like you said, there's this long-standing thing of audits and audits. We don't even use that word anymore in Wandsworth. We call it practice assurance. But the idea that audits equals scrutiny and criticism. And I think that comes from legacies of local authorities and other agencies just trying to get to a point where, you're having consistently good practice and achieving good things for families and children. And I think for us now in Wandsworth, our learning episodes, as we call them, they're much more collaborative. Like the practitioner's drawn into that process to talk about their work with the child and with the family. Practice reviewers go out and observe practice. They get feedback from the families. So I like to think it feels like a much more holistic look at practice rather than just going, oh, your chronology is not up to date, your assessment was out of time, all these tick boxy things, when actually what we want to hear about is what is the practice making a difference for that child and family? Like, what positive impact are we having? And if we're not having an impact, why? And what can we do? And the idea that at the end of those learning episodes, there's sort of agreed actions between the team and the reviewer about how to improve things, how to move things forward. And I think building it in as a collaborative process where it's about hearing about more than just what you're not doing. And I like to think we really draw out some of the good practice in it. And I think, being that critical friend isn't just about being critical. It's about providing that feedback in a way that is coming from a place of support, of a place from how can we improve things, but also taking it away from that one practitioner. It's about what can we learn about us as an organisation and us as a partnership from doing this so that we can replicate that across more than one family.
Can I just sort of add about the practice assurance? Lindsay's been running it for the last year at least. And they're multi-agency every quarter. And the health input into those practice assurance meetings has been so positive for the staff. They're very nervous about going, brief them before they go. We have done dip samples of lots of cases and then looked at some cases in greater depth. And then they've gone to meetings at practice assurance panels where they've met all the other practitioners and the managers that have worked with the family. And we've looked at the good practice as well as where there's been some weaknesses or areas where we need to make some improvements. And then to get the feedback from the child and from the parents, that's just so important. And everyone in health that's been part of the practice assurance has been really positive. So I think it's, it's a really sort of...
But it's a loop, isn't it? It's ensuring that you're reviewing, you're reflecting, you're learning, you're being put. But I'm curious about, what do you think? I know you're all great critical friends. It might be difficult, but what are the barriers to being a positive critical friend?
Confidence, I would say, is a big one in schools. I think if you're say a safeguarding lead who's only recently taken up the role, it can be quite daunting when you first sit in your first child protection meeting, or when you first phone the MASH line. If you don't have the knowledge, the experience, it can be quite daunting. So I think we really need to be aware of that, and we need to empower our new staff to actually understand the rights and responsibilities they do have in their positions. And if they've got a gut feeling about something, they do need to speak up. They have a duty to do that. So that's certainly a big barrier that I've noticed in schools for people who are particularly new to the role.
I think within health as well, it's confidence with newly qualified staff. I think within safeguarding remit, it's the area that new staff tend to worry the most about out of all the work that they're undertaking. And it's about giving additional support to new people, mentoring them, having learning groups, as well as very regular supervision.
I think for my organisation, I would say it's defensiveness. A lot of people sometimes don't like hearing
You haven't done it
you know,
right.
something hasn't been done right or something could be done better. A lot of the time, obviously, it's how it's put to that person. If you put it in, you know, an appropriate way, then it doesn't come across as, you know, you're giving just negative feedback. But we do have occasions whereby, you know, you have to pick up on someone and what they've done, and it may not be done the best as it could, and it ends up quite a tense situation because it almost ends up in an argument because the person doesn't agree, because the person doesn't appreciate the bigger picture and the values and everything around it, but it hasn't been explained properly to them. And it does sometimes get quite challenging when you're getting in those environments. Yeah, defensiveness does seem to be, it comes out quite a bit sometimes.
In social care, what do you think is the barrier?
Yeah, why not? I think one of, you know what? I think one of the real challenges is whether this is something that's sort of new and being played out now, or it's something that's sort of historical, is poor relationships between organisations, and how some professionals or how some organisations perceive and view other organisations. I think another challenge also is that when we come together, we generally are asking for help, whether it's from the police, whether it's from education, whether it's from health. And sometimes, you know, services may be overloaded, may be overstretched, may have their own criteria or thresholds, but essentially might not be able to give us the answers that we want or the help that we want at that time. And I think sometimes that can further impact on the relationship, or can make practitioners feel that other organisations or professionals representing those organisations don't fully understand the concerns or want to help, which I don't think necessarily is true, because I think sometimes, you know, working in a multi-agency way, just because another organisation's there and is unable to maybe do what you might want at that time, one, it's important that they have the information. Two, it's important that they have the knowledge and understanding of what our particular concerns might be. Three, if it comes to a point where they have to be involved, it's better that they've already been aware of the situation. And, you know, if they do end up becoming involved, at least they know how to respond to the situation. So, but I think those are some of the challenges that I've seen on the ground floor.
I think it can sometimes be hard when you're in those moments as well to recognise that that's the moment to be the critical friend, if you like. And sometimes you don't realise till you're back at the office and you're talking to your colleague about it. So I think it's about then having the space to think through, well, how do I follow up with that? I'm not going to see that network together until the next child in need meeting in a month's time. How can I have that conversation that's going to make a difference now that I'm out of that space? Because I think it takes quite a lot of self-reflection in the moment to kind of take yourself out of that situation, look at it as at a distance and say, actually, I need to provide a bit of challenge here because this pattern's repeating, or this conversation's getting a bit stuck, or I think they're viewing a family in a way that's not particularly helpful. And I think not always recognising that in the moment is one of the challenges, and how you then follow up on that with that professional.
So I'm going to put you onto the spotlight to think about the agency that you feel that your agency has the worst communication with, and why.
Fascinating question.
Well, a very good question.
So if you were to think about it, you're going to represent your agency, what would they say? Not you particularly, Ian, but what would, because you are from a different position. You're from a position in the partnership that you work and you see our great collaborative work, right? Talking about the not so high ups. What would they say?
I would say probably the NHS.
Oh.
Only because we seem to have a lot more dealings with the local authorities and the social workers and on a daily basis. And I found this in my position. For example, obviously we got Justin, you got Fergus from the LICB, who sit on the exec board with me. I can always get answers to them. They can always get answers to me. But I think from the ground roots and the start, they, especially within the police, struggle a little bit harder with the NHS just because they don't know who to go to. Partly could be my fault. Because obviously they end up dealing with people, for example, with NA&E. They don't know the best people to speak to. And let's be honest, A&Es are very difficult, high-pressure environments. And when you've got police officers in A&E dealing with something, it can get quite challenging. So, from my perspective, I think we could do a lot more, for example, especially within the grassroots within policing how to work better, for example, with our NHS partners.
And NHS partners, how would you work better with the police knowing that you're probably the least communicative service that they respond to?
Well, it's interesting that you say that, but I'm just thinking that for the police to know who the safeguarding leads are within each organisation. So I'm from the community health services for the health visiting and school nursing service in Wandsworth. And then we'd have our hospitals, our main hospitals, for example, St George's. There's safeguarding leads there for children, and then within the mental health trust, there's safeguarding leads there for the mental health trust.
But can you hear, for me, that sounds so complex. Like we've used words like ICB, NHS, St George's, and there's like several hats under one service. Do you know what I mean? And so for someone that might be going to A&E, then to work out who is the right umbrella under that particular, how can we simplify that? Because communication, I think, is again, who's the right man for the job. You know, I call Children's Social Care, I call MASH, there's one number. With you guys, there's 9 numbers.
I think it's difficult. So if you've got police and it's an acute situation and you're down in A&E in the hospital, the named professional for safeguarding may not be there out of hours anyway. It's a 9-to-5 service. So it would be, you know, the manager of the ED department that they would need to speak to, and they would have an understanding.
But defending the NHS side is they do have a lot under the umbrella.
Loads.
Especially if you look, you've got the mental health things down this end, and down the other end, as I said, you've got, you know, maybe children's services down there. There's so many different things.
Can you see how that communication could be skewed once, because you don't even know where to channel the, you know, if you have an issue as a police officer, you want to be critical, as a critical friend, to say, you know what, I attended the A&E on this day, whatever time, and this was the incident, I really want to reflect on it. If you don't really have a smooth area of where I'm going to point this concern or critique to, it can, I can't be asked, look at this website, it's a bit confusing, there's 9 million people here, who do I talk to? And she's only 9 to 5, I'm Saturday at 7 o'clock. Do you know what I mean? So that for me can block the communication. So I'm going to ask you, education, who would be your most difficult, and be honest.
So I've been thinking about it while you've been talking. So I think I would probably say, from a primary school perspective, it's probably the police. The main reason being, because the children aren't age of criminal responsibility anyway, so there's very little kind of formal contact that we have with the police. And I think the only way we kind of have communication at the moment is through Operation Encompass, those notifications we receive. It's often at moments of crisis, so it's often at moments, and having that sort of preemptive contact and communication with the police would probably be beneficial, but I understand.
Oh, don't give him his reason.
Well, no.
I need to hear what's he going to do better.
I completely agree with that. And I've always been a fan of, for example, putting police officers into, you know, the younger primary school environment, just for awareness, really. I think the key thing is, and the dangers, for example, you know, of exploitation, criminal or sexual exploitation.
Younger. It starts in primary school.
I know it's difficult to say that, but it might just be my opinion, but it does feel like it's got younger.
Yeah.
Which is obviously not good, which means we need to really keep up with it. Because I'll be honest, you know, I've heard of some good work, for example, with, you know, some of the schools officers in the secondary schools, building up relationships with the pupils and what have you. But you just don't have any of that at the primary school, because you're right, it's that legal age, isn't it? It makes you feel uncomfortable, for example, presenting to 8 or 9-year-olds about the potential dangers of, you know, exploitation, but it doesn't mean it shouldn't be done. But for the partnership, it's a really sensitive area, because then if you're educating children into dangers which potentially are out there, you then got to think of the parents, because let's be honest, do the parents want their 8 or 9-year-olds being spoken to about, for example, gang violence? And I think, I don't know who's the parent here, but I would feel a little bit uncomfortable. But obviously the police part of my brain would think, oh, it needs to be done, and it'd be that internal challenge in my own head, really. So I completely agree with it, and I do think it needs to be looked at, possibly at the partnership level, but probably, you know, higher up than that, because it is, let's be honest, they soak up information like sponges, don't they, at that age? So
it's a balance, isn't it? Because we talk about this as social workers as well. Like, sometimes there's a bit of trepidation about doing direct work about a child's experiences, and you've got to remember they're living it. These children that you could be talking to could well be experiencing the early stages of exploitation or seeing it around them or have older siblings. So it's a real balance, isn't it, between what sort of parents might be worried about, but then also what children are actually being exposed to in the community and what they're becoming aware of from younger ages, and how do we tackle that? And I think from a police point of view, you know, there's relationships to repair and build in communities that could be quite helpful for.
And on an individual family basis, I mean, a bit like you were talking earlier, information sharing can be a barrier. You know, the legalities around what can be shared. I mean, there have been cases that I've worked on where the police have held lots of really useful information about a family, and it's not been until we've got to, say, CP level that we finally hear it, and you think, oh, I wish I'd known that. But I completely understanding why it hadn't been shared earlier can be a potential, you know, something that could be improved and could make our communication relationship better.
Aileen, who is your least successful communicative partner?
It probably would be the police as well. Yeah. Well, I think within Wandsworth we've got good relationships with social care. I do know who to go to. You don't always get the response you want, but I would always know who to go to. And I think just having been around for a long time, you build those relationships. So I think we don't have as much to do with the police in community healthcare. So be interesting to see how we could build.
Do you have a rebuttal, or would you
No,
like to stick with yours?
I think you're right. I'm going to pat myself on the back and say I think at my level, for example, I work very closely with Justin and Fergus. We meet regularly. We talk about things, but we're up there, and all the work gets done down there, doesn't it?
Exactly.
So the problem is you know, if I'm looking at my detectives, for example, detective constables, police constables who do most of the work on the ground, do they have that sort of relationship, you know, with the key partners? I would say only if you're on a specialist, you know, for example, if you're on a mesh desk, if you're on a referrals desk, you have that because you're put into that position where you do it on a daily basis. But that will be 10% of your total workforce has that, and you've got 90% of your workforce doesn't have anything like that. And for them, it must be really quite frustrating, for example, when they don't know who to speak to, you know, which social workers to come into, which managers, and all the rest of it. And obviously, yes, it puts me in that position where I know who to speak to, but that's not good enough sometimes, really, is it? Because to be honest, I sit and look at strategies. I don't actually deal with the work, which is where everything gets done, isn't it? So yeah, it's
Definitely. Right, social care. Are you going to collaborate in one?
I'm really interested to see what Derek would say from a different position in the organisation.
Indeed, we are in two different places, but I'll just say to the police, you know, I don't think in social care that police are one of the organisations that we struggle to work with. We work very closely with the police a lot. I'm very passionate about working with teenagers who are either being exploited or at risk of exploitation, you know, and we've worked amazingly with the police, not just in this borough. I've done it in lots of other boroughs as well, where we've worked closely with the child abuse investigation team, worked closely with the gangs units, and they've been amazing with sort of safety planning work with us, and some of all of the other partners in health and education as well. So I've had really positive experiences working with the police.
Don't avoid the question.
Well, the question is, what is the most challenging organisation?
Yeah.
The most challenging organisation for me as a social worker, and this is not something that is down to me working in Wandsworth. This is something that I've experienced in many, many boroughs. I think it's an issue that has been bubbling for quite some time. But
I feel like I need a drum roll.
Yes, but the reality of it is CAMS. You know, CAMS are the most difficult people for us in social care. One of the reasons is because CAMS has this high threshold to get referrals in. Two, another issue is there's a lot of children. Now we understand neurodiversity even more. There's a lot of children who need to be assessed, who you cannot get assessed. All right. Another issue also is that, for example, when COVID happened, we saw that ADHD, you know, the government decided that with the new NICE guidelines, it's going to be seen as a mental health problem, and these children need to be prescribed medication by a psychiatrist, and that actually without the right support around their ADHD, the right medication and whatnot, they can end up having other mental health problems. So we've got a whole lot of children who need to be assessed, who are struggling with mental health. We've got children who are struggling with OCD, struggling with paranoia, displaying violence at home. We've even got children who have been exploited and have experienced significant amounts of trauma, whether that's because they have been victims of abuse or victims of youth violence, or whether it's because they live in communities where their friends, children at their school, have been killed or have been victims of violence. So we have a whole load of children in this community and across the whole of the country, to be honest, especially in the cities, who need therapeutic support for the trauma that they've experienced or need to be assessed for additional learning needs, and whose mental health is deteriorating, but we can't get them through the door to CAMHS.
So that communication is null and void. Lastly, Lindsay.
Yeah, I mean, I was thinking about it and I was kind of toying up between thinking about the broad practice spectrum that I see, whether it would be the police in terms of not as an organisation, but where you've got officers working different types of cases. So you might have CID involved, you might have Kate involved with another, you might have had a Merlin from a police officer who's sort of a PC and trying to get hold of them amongst shift patterns. I was like, that could be quite challenging. Rather than as an organisation, I think strategy meetings, we get a lot of communication that way. We get a lot of Merlins, obviously, but perhaps contacting the individuals. But then as you were talking, I was thinking, actually, I think for social workers, health as a system can be quite hard to navigate because you've
GPs.
usually got,
GPs.
you've got the GPs, but you've also got everything else that comes with that. And although you've got your school nurse and your health visitor, who you might be in good communication with as part of your plan for the child, you've still got to contact someone else to get any other health information. GPs being one of them. It's a very good point.
So, I mean, we can see that there are strengths and weaknesses in all the organisations, and I think the whole conclusion has to be that overall, on the partnership strategic level, we have really developed and fostered an environment and a culture where being a critical friend is important and we listen, respectfully communicate. There are still gaps lower down in the operational levels that we need to make newly qualified staff feel more comfortable, giving them the skills, tools and training to do so. There's instances where there's lack of communication between agencies that we can foster better channels of communication with time. But overall, I think the conclusion is that being a critical friend is important. And as long as we can continue to foster the environment for it to flourish, our children in Wandsworth will be safe. And I want to say thank you for coming on to this episode and hope to catch you on another. Thank you, guys.